It's the day before the final exam, and despite your best intentions, you've done no studying. Maybe you read the book, you didn't. You sit down, you take out the textbook, take out all the slides from the course, you grab the notes that you borrowed off the kid who sits at the front of the class and transcribes every single word that the prof says verbatim. It's time to cram, and that's when you start to get stressed out. What's up, everyone? I'm Adam, and I'm a former lawyer, former business exec, and current college prof. And in this video, I want to tell you about the right way to cram, even though every single teacher you've ever had has told you that you probably shouldn't. So first off, let's be real. Cramming is stressful. It doesn't work as well as normal studying. You're not actually learning anything. But if you're here, that means that ship has already sailed, and I'm not going to spend this video wagging my finger at you. Instead, I want to give you some tips to actually get the most out of the time that you actually have left before the final exam, because most of the other advice I've seen on cramming is either unhelpful, misguided, or just plain wrong. The first thing you want to do when you're settling in for a cram session is you want to set your expectations, because the reality is if you've gotten to this point, you probably know that the time to shoot for an A+ in this course has sailed. Now, I'm not saying A+s don't happen for people who cram. It can happen, but realistically, if that was really your goal, you probably should have done some things earlier. And so if you have 24 hours before an exam to study, you need to kind of set some realistic expectations about what you can accomplish and what you can't accomplish. So thinking that you can digest the entire textbook in 24 hours, not going to happen. So let's figure out what we can do and what we can't do, and let's figure out what is humanly possible of us so we can get the best possible grade and not shoot ourselves in the foot by aiming for the moon and falling flat on our face. The first thing you want to do when cramming is you need to kind of guess what's going to be on the exam. Now, this is something you should be doing regardless of whether you're cramming or just studying normally, but it's especially important when you're cramming because when you're cramming, you're going to have to make some choices about what you spend a lot of time learning or studying and what you kind of leave to the side. And so making an educated guess about what you think will be covered on that exam and what will not be is going to be really, really important. And there's a few things you can do to help you kind of get a sense of what's going to be in there. First off, what I would say is start by asking yourself who actually wrote this exam. And that's going to be important because it's not, depending on who wrote the exam, what you're going to look at for clues about what's in the exam is going to be a little bit different. So for instance, if you're in a seminar style course where there is only one section of this course and this prof is the one who created and designed everything and they are the one who is writing the final exam, then you are really going to want to pay attention to the points that this professor has repeated over and over again during the semester. Anything that they have mentioned more than once is probably because it's something that's important to them and something that you should be paying attention to. So even sort of side little anecdotes, funny stories, things that come up in lectures that may not even seem related to stuff that was in the assigned readings, if that is something that's coming up often, it's probably something that's important to that prof. And so it is probably based on a topic that they think is important enough that they're going to want to test you on during this exam. Conversely, if you're taking a course which is sort of a intro course where you're in a 200-person study hall and there's 10 different sections of this course with multiple different profs teaching the same course, then that is what, at least at my university, we call a coordinated course. And in a coordinated course, usually there's one main coordinator who is the one who's responsible for making sure that every single section of that course is learning and being tested on the same thing, which means that the professor that you have is probably not going to be the person who's actually writing that exam. So the tips that I just gave you about what to look for in an exam when the professor is the one writing the exam are almost the exact opposite of what you need to be looking at when you are trying to figure out what's going to be in an exam in a coordinated course. In a coordinated course, oftentimes the professor doesn't even know what's going to be on that final exam until a few days before that exam actually comes out. And so the little funny anecdotes that they tell during class or, the side tangents that they go on, those are things that they might personally think are important, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those things are going to show up on the exam. So then what do you do in that case? If you are taking a coordinated course and the person who's writing the exam isn't the person who's actually giving the lectures, do you just give up and just try and learn everything and hope for the best? No, there's obviously still things that you can look at, right? The first being the course syllabus. The syllabus is going to be a treasure trove of information of what the course coordinator believes is really important. And in there, you're probably going to have a bunch of learning objectives. And those learning objectives, in some jurisdictions, are actually the school is legally obligated to test you on those learning objectives. But even if you're not in a jurisdiction where that's the case, people don't generally create learning objectives just for the fun of it. If they're creating a learning objective, it's because they have said these are things that we believe are important enough that we are going to test you on. And generally speaking, the person creating the syllabus is the same person who's going to be writing the final exam. And so you can look at that syllabus and get a really good idea of what that person believes is going to be important. The other thing that you can look to is in your readings, if you are using a textbook or something like that, the beginning of every chapter, usually there's going to be a list of points of things that are going to be important in that chapter. You're going to want to focus on specifically those points to make sure you understand what those are, as opposed to trying to read verbatim every single word that's in that chapter. And then which chapters in that textbook you're going to want to focus on. Again, a lot of that is going to be dictated by what the course syllabus looks like. So even if your specific class spent 3 weeks on a given chapter, but in the syllabus, it was only scheduled to be half of a class, then that chapter probably isn't as important as the emphasis that was put on it during your lectures. So these are things that are kind of looking behind the curtains of how courses are structured that can help you get a sense of what material will be on an exam and what won't be. And again, this is going to be really important because you only have a limited amount of time to learn this stuff. And so you're going to want to focus all of your attention on the really important stuff, and you're going to want to ignore everything that probably isn't going to be on the exam. The next tip I have for you is something that might seem counterintuitive, but it is that you should absolutely not, whatever you do at this point, do not read the book. Okay, I'm going to say that again. If you have a textbook for this course or if you have assigned readings, now is not the time to start doing those readings. And the reason for this is simple. If you have a short period of time in which to absorb a lot of information, reading through every single word of a textbook is not going to be the best way for you to absorb that information and to retain it even for a 24-hour period. Even if you manage to read through that entire textbook, it's probably going to take you half of the time you have left, and it's go in one ear and out the other. So forget about the textbook. Don't worry about reading every single thing that was assigned. At this point, you're going to have to look for more efficient ways to absorb that material. And that's what I want to cover in this next point. So if you're not reading the textbook, how are you going to learn this material? Well, the way you're going to do this is you are going to dig up practice exams, previous semester's exams, exams that you find online, even if they're not from your specific course, they're from a different university, but it's a related topic. That's what you're going to want to focus on here, because what this will do is this will give you a sense of the type of questions that can appear on that final exam. And when you have the questions at this stage, especially early on in your cram session, if you have not done a lot of the work throughout the semester, you're going to be reading those questions and you're going to be completely lost. And this is really what you want, right? Because that's going to give you a sense of the gaps in your knowledge. And once you have the questions, then you can pull out that textbook that I told you not to read, and you can go and hunt for the answers to those specific questions in the textbook. And it's the hunting for the answers that is actually going to help you gain that knowledge. Whereas reading a textbook cover to cover is going to be a complete waste of time because you're not going to retain anything. The actual act of saying, here's a question and let me go look for that answer is a process by which you're going to be engaging your brain, engaging your memory, so that when you actually do find the answer to this, it's actually going to be much more likely to stick in your brain. Now, the chances that the questions that you have in your practice exams and in previous year exams are going to be identical to what you get in your final exam are relatively slim. Sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll get professors that are really lazy and just use previous year exams and just kind of slightly modify questions, in which case you have just lucked out. But if you don't have a prof who does that, that doesn't really change the advice I'm giving you, because it's still the best way to prepare. Because even if it's not the same question, the topics that are being covered by these questions are still going to be similar to the topics that are going to be covered in the final exam. And so in the process of looking for the answer to the question in the practice exam, you're still going to be accumulating the knowledge that you need to answer similar questions on similar topics in your exam. And it's going to be a lot more effective than if you were, for example, just to look at a previous year exam and then memorize the answers to that exam, or worse, if you're just going to pull out a textbook and read it cover to cover. Those, sort of brute force memorization techniques, they could potentially work, but probably not with the amount of time you have left. So hunting and searching for answers and then answering questions from sources that are going to be related to what you're answering on that final exam, that's going to be the best approach you have to actually learning this material in a really short period of time. The next thing you're going to want to do here is you are going to want to figure out which pieces of information you need to know for that final exam that you are absolutely never going to be able to sort of get a basic understanding of, and that you're just going to have to memorize. Now, when you do this, please understand that the moment you do this, you have basically declared that I am never going to remember this information after I write this final exam, and I'm basically going to be wiping the slate clean of everything that I learned. Because what you're doing is not really learning, it's just plain memorizing. But again, if we were having a conversation about the best way to retain knowledge, we'd be having a completely different conversation. Right now, your entire goal is just to say, I, for whatever reason, need to get this done for the last minute. So let me find a way to prepare for this, 2, 3, 4 hour period of time where I need to write this exam and then be done with it. And maybe someday in the future, I'll actually learn this stuff. For now, you need to focus on your short-term memory, which means that the only way you're going to do this is not going to be based on a bunch of learning techniques, which you would use if you were studying properly, but rather full-on memorization techniques. And the way to do that is essentially there's a couple ways you can do this. One is pure brute force memorization, where you look at something and you try and repeat it word for word in your mind. This is the way most of us learned how to do memorization in grade school, right? You read a line, you cover the line, you say it in your head, and then you say it out loud, and then you repeat it over and over and over again. That's brute force memorization. That is probably the least effective way to memorize any information. But at this stage in the game, you got to do something. Other more effective ways, you can use mnemonic devices, right? So mnemonic devices are any kind of saying where you can use the first letter of a sentence or a word to try and represent a series of pieces of information that are going to be easier to recall. So for example, if you go to things like, how do you remember the colors of a rainbow in order? They're red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. I never memorized that, but I did memorize when I was a little kid, Roy G. Biv, which is an absurd name, which is spelled out using ROYGBIV. Each of those letters is the first letter of the colors of the rainbow. And so I know that Roy G. Biv is red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. That is an example of a mnemonic device. You can create your own for any type of information that you need to memorize. So have fun with it. The more creative you get, the more fun, the more bizarre and outlandish these devices are going to be, the more they're going to stick. So this has the added side benefit of actually helping you to remember things and have some fun while you're doing it. Because let's be honest, cramming's not fun. So if you can make it fun, then you will probably do a little bit better. The other memorization trick you can use is something called the memory palace, which if you've ever, read a Sherlock Holmes story, or if you've watched a Sherlock Holmes movie or that fantastic BBC series, you'll know what this is. Essentially, you picture in your mind a location that you're really familiar with. So, for example, your childhood home, and you imagine yourself walking through that location, and in every room of that location, you place an object that will recall to you the thing that you are trying to memorize. And oftentimes, this is even more effective if you pair it with sort of an absurd little story, because the more outlandish it is, the more your brain will recall it. So if I was trying to remember, for example, the planets in the solar system, I could walk into my childhood home, open the front door, and in the front vestibule, I would have Mercury, who is, to me, Mercury is a thermometer, is what you find in a thermometer. So maybe I walk into that front vestibule and there's a life-size thermometer that is standing right there as I open the door. So very first planet in the solar system is Mercury. As I walk from the vestibule into the living area, which is the next room as I walk through my childhood home, well, in that room, I have a giant statue of Aphrodite, who's also known as Venus. And Venus is the second planet in the solar system. I walk out of that room and into the hallway. And in the hallway, I've got a bunch of dirt on the ground. Dirt is Earth. Earth is the third planet in the solar system, and so on and so forth. And so you get the idea. There's a ton of videos on YouTube about how to do a memory palace, how to create one. But the idea here is just use a spatial sense of where you place things and then have really vivid imagery that is going to help you remember different things that are associated to the stuff that you're trying to memorize. The next tip I have for you is related to one of the previous tips, which is about being realistic in terms of what you can actually accomplish and being realistic about what your limitations are in terms of acquiring and storing information. There are a bunch of techniques out there about how you should focus for a certain period of time and then take a break and then come back and focus. So you have things like the Pomodoro technique, which advocates, studying really hard for 25 minutes, taking a 5-minute break, then doing another 25 minutes. You repeat that cycle for 4 25-minute periods, and then you take a 15-minute break, and then you go over and you do that again for another 4 times, and then you would take a longer break, and so on and so forth. The actual length of time of the cycle doesn't really matter that much in my experience. And in fact, I think you should probably play with that to suit your needs a little bit better. I personally have always found the 25-minute time period too short, because by the time I really get into the flow of studying, I feel like that time limit expires too quickly. The one thing that I will say is there's a ton of research that's been done that says the outer limit of the amount of time that people can focus for is probably somewhere around 90 minutes. So if you're going to use this sort of on-off form of concentration, make sure that your on periods are not going to be anything longer than 90 minutes. But if you were to do, for example, 90 minutes of really focused studying, and then a 30-minute break, and then another 90 minutes of really focused studying, that's something that could potentially work. 25 minutes, 5 minutes, or 50 minutes, 10 minutes, all of these things are things that can work. But the important thing is to give yourself time where you are fully focused on the task of studying, and then give your brain a break so that you are not exhausting yourself. Because if you go beyond the point where you're exhausted, none of that information you're trying to accumulate is actually going to go in. You're just going to be wasting time and wasting effort. The other thing I will say is during these periods of intense focus, you actually do need to make sure you are absolutely 100% focused. Put your phone in airplane mode, turn off every other device, get yourself, I don't know, get yourself a kitchen egg timer, which I actually have one in my office, and use that to set the time that you're going to be working for. The point is during your focus time, you should actually be 100% focused. You cannot be interrupted by text messages or by friends who are, tapping you on the shoulder or by, some well-meaning relative who's dropping off lunch or something like that. Your focus periods need to be 100% focused. Otherwise, this entire process kind of goes out the window. The next tip I have for you is related to the previous point, and that is to create a schedule for yourself at the beginning of your cram session and ruthlessly stick to that schedule. What I mean by that is if you have decided that there are 10 topics that are going to be on this final exam and you have roughly, 10 hours worth of focus time in which you can actually prepare for the exam. And each one of these topics you're going to give it an hour in length. Make yourself that schedule and then make sure you stick to it. Even if you're on the third topic, but you haven't quite grasped it yet, if your hour runs out, shut it down, move to the next topic. The reason for this is quite simple. Again, your time is limited. Time is your biggest opponent in this instance. If you are going to spend way too much time on a single topic, that is not going to help you, right? You're better off having a decent understanding of all of the topics that are going to be on the exam than having a really, really great understanding of one of the 10 topics that are going to be on that exam, because you'd rather get partial marks on every question on the final than full marks on one question and zero on everything else, right? So create yourself a schedule, give yourself an idea of how much time you can spend on each concept or each topic, and make sure you stick to that schedule. Even if you don't feel 100% confident in the topic that you have just visited, if your time is up, move on to the next thing, and just hope that you don't have a ton of questions on that topic in the final exam, because this is something that can really, really hurt students when they kind of get stuck on one individual thing. And I can tell you, as someone who corrects final exams, you can tell when students do this because you'll ask them one question on the exam and they clearly studied something completely different. So they will find a way to take the material that they learned and shove it into the answer to a completely unrelated question. The marks don't really end up well for those students. So make sure you're setting yourself that schedule and you're sticking to it ruthlessly. And the last tip that I have for you, and this is one that in my experience, most students have a really hard time with, is you are better off waking up early than going to bed late. This is my personal experience when I have had to cram and study for things. When you go to bed late, you are essentially putting yourself in a situation where you're almost guaranteed to wake up tired the next day. Whereas generally speaking, we say that sleep is something that is going to help your memory solidify everything that you've learned in the previous day. The problem is every technique we've looked at for how to cram well is not something where you are going to be engaging long-term memory. Everything that we're trying to do here is purely short-term based. And so you are probably better off waking up really early before an exam, cramming as much stuff into your short-term memory as possible, and then getting it out onto paper as quickly as you can before it flies out of your head again. Then you are trying to make sure you encode things into your brain through a good night's sleep, and then hoping that it's going to stick around long enough for that final exam that you're writing the next day. I know this is super counterintuitive, and this is counter to every single piece of research that's ever been done on the proper ways of learning. But again, cramming is not learning. Cramming is a band-aid solution for a situation that you've gotten yourself into. And so if you're just going to apply the same techniques to cramming that you do to regular studying, you're not going to get great results. You might not get great results anyway from cramming, but at least you can give yourself the best chances by calling it what it is, calling a spade, and understanding that what you're doing here is a short-term band-aid, and you can't use all the same techniques that you would normally use if this was something that you'd been preparing for weeks or months. And lastly, here's a bonus tip for you. This doesn't actually have anything to do with cramming, but it's about how to write the exam. And when you're writing the exam, even though this is advice every student has heard before, in my experience, not everyone does it, but especially when you're cramming, it's super important. Make sure you read through the entire exam and answer first those questions that you're really, really confident about. There's a few reasons to do this. The first is that remember that because you crammed, everything currently is stored in your short-term memory. So by answering those questions you're confident about, you're making sure you're getting it down on paper before it flies out of your brain. The second thing that this does is you make sure that you're not going to run out of time later and leave marks on the table. And lastly, the other advantage of working this way is that as you're writing down the answers to these questions, it might start to jog your memory of other things that you learned, and it might actually help you get the answers to other questions that you were less confident about in the first place. So now that you've done all this and you have gotten through your final exam and you've decided that was terrible and I never want to do this again, now is probably a good time for you to check out my video on how you should actually be studying in university, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for other tips and lessons that you probably should have learned in school but didn't. Good luck.